When it premiered at the Venice Biennale in September 1951, audiences and critics were ambivalent about Stravinsky's opera The Rake's Progress. Set to a libretto by W. H. Auden and Chester Kallman, the reviewer from a Milan newspaper called it an act of birth and a certificate of death, a declaration of love and a sign of impotence, a miracle of open-mindedness and a triumph of conventionality. Everything and nothing, everything that has for centuries existed within the orbit of melodrama. Nothing that can stand comparison with all that those centuries have given us. Nothing, that is, which might open up the hope of a substantial renewal of dramatic expression. Most reviewers recognized the music and text as the product of a brilliantly imaginative modern composer and poet. But the original production and most subsequent early productions showed the work in a drab light. The opera seemed destined to become a curious footnote until, in 1961, Ingmar Bergman staged it at the Swedish Royal Opera in Stockholm. Bergman was the first director to take seriously not just the opera's 18th century setting, but its archaic musical and literary style. By creating a theatrical style as anachronistic as the music and text, Bergman showed Stravinsky and Auden's moral tale to be not only freshly imaginative and sharply focused, but deceptively expressive as well. For the first couple of years, skeptical critics and company directors were willing to grant Stravinsky the benefit of doubt. After all, whether good or bad, a Stravinsky premiere guaranteed an audience. By 1953, the opera had been performed over 200 times, with over 15 productions in Germany alone. However, only in February 1953 would Stravinsky's opera be heard as intended by a native English-speaking audience performed by one of the world's most prestigious houses, the Metropolitan Opera in New York. As expected, the Met contracted the finest talent money could buy. Here you see large sets designed by Horace Armistead. And as stage director, the composer got to handpick his most trusted, sympathetic, and beloved collaborator, the choreographer George Balanchine. Balanchine explained his approach in the official program notes. In this opera, I think of myself entirely as Stravinsky's messenger, acknowledging, first of all, that the soul of opera is in its voices. The Rake's Progress is a most serious work. I've tried to bring it to a maximum of orderly action as clearly demanded by book and music, without decoration, delivering its message without comment of choreography. But the opera got mostly dismal reviews. Worse, the audiences were unenthusiastic. Vera Stravinsky was overheard remarking to her husband after the second performance, "I heard a lot of yawns tonight." Having lavished such resources into production, the Met scheduled more performances for the following season. However, the excitement of the premiere had evaporated, and the production itself failed to ignite further interest. The Times reviewer gloated. The house was poorly filled when the performance started. By the end of the second act, people were leaving in scores, in many cases between the scenes, while a number scarcely waited for the second act to end before making for the exit. It is clear that the public is tired of this opera, and by no means without justification. So what went wrong? Many of the problems could be attributed to the Met's overly large theater. But most surprising, however, was Balanchine's static and unimaginative staging. In deferring to his friend's expressed intent to create a narrowly defined conventional opera, Balanchine seems to have missed the essential spirit of the work. In rereading the program notes for the Met performances, one wonders if even Stravinsky and his librettists fully understood what they had created. Luckily, a new production in distant Scotland was about to arrive in the nick of time. Of the various early productions, Glyndebourne's would be the most lasting and probably closest to what Stravinsky had in mind when he first imagined the opera. The whole work seemed more right and real for an English audience, said a critic, than it had for the miscellaneous one in America. The more suitable theater helped considerably. Marvelously designed and produced, the opera gave the Edinburgh Festival one of its most electric occasions of its 7-year history. It gave Britain the top operatic event of the year. Glyndebourne Company threw itself into its task with great gusto. When I saw The Rake's Progress in New York and Paris, I found the action rather drab and skimpy. Not so in Edinburgh. It is no exaggeration to suggest that the Met's performances in 1953 and 54 came close to sinking The Rake's Progress before it could set sail. The American public, at least, seemed ready to relegate the opera, in spite of its length and pedigree, to the composer's second tier of works, interesting to specialists, but limited and flawed. However, the 1953 Glyndebourne production, which would be revived repeatedly over the next decade at the festival's elegant home in Sussex, told a different story. Presented in the right context and actively interpreted, the Rake's progress could be a lasting masterpiece. Attaining such a rarefied status, though, would require more than a single excellent production. A true masterpiece attracts and influences other masters, who themselves in turn shape and transform the work. The first such masters to be so drawn to the Rake's progress would be the eminent Swedish film and stage director Ingmar Bergman. "I've always felt close to Stravinsky," he explained to one interviewer. "His way of thinking is close to mine. His very severe, very cold-hot way of expressing himself fascinates me." Years later, Stravinsky would write to Bergman, "I remember your creation of the Rake as one of the most beautiful and original realizations of any of my theater pieces that I had ever seen on any stage." Such was no idle compliment coming from a composer who had seen his operas and ballets staged by some of the most imaginative directors and choreographers of the 20th century. Critics shared his enthusiasm. The critic from London Daily Press called it one of the most compelling pieces of theatrical wizardry I have seen in any opera house. Stravinsky attended a special performance in September 1961 and discussed the production at length with the director over dinner a few days later. His associate Robert Kraft took copious notes. The critics' glowing reviews confirmed Kraft's recollection of several distinctive features that made Bergman's interpretation so effective. 1. His rationale for a two-act division. 2. His recreation not just of an 18th century setting, but of an 18th century theatrical production. And 3. His strict control of distancing stage effects, combined with careful attention to details of characterization and expression, even for individual members of the chorus. One of Bergman's initial ideas was that the opera should be divided into 2 acts of 5 and 4 scenes each, principally because Act 2 was published, did not have a strong beginning, middle, end structure. "As I see it," Bergman asserted, "the play up to the unveiling of Baba's beard is one line, and not only the play but also the music. This is the protasis. The rest is the peripeteia. I was more concerned about connecting the episodes along those 2 lines than with rounded act structures." Bergman's other initial idea was that the stage should be sufficiently long and deep to permit the actors to appear and disappear in darkness instead of through doors, superimposed upon the wide stage of the 19th century Royal Opera House. The set, designed by Bergling, assimilates the narrow but deep dimensions of the 18th century Slottstheater at Drottningholm, the royal palace near Stockholm. And Bergman's production team took pains not just to set the opera in the 18th century, but to recreate aspects of an authentic 18th century production. Bergman created a scenic milieu with numerous concessions to Baroque tradition. A bare wooden sloping stage extending over the orchestra pit and ending with a row of 6 oversized footlight tins of 17th century model. Wings and backdrops presented naively painted pictures, changed in open view. The principal singers acted mainly close to the footlights. To further assimilate the intimate performance setting of an 18th century court theater, Bergman went so far as to introduce a master of ceremonies, reminiscent of the majordomo in Strauss's Ariadne auf Naxos. You can see this character right here, holding a staff with arms out. Before the overture even begins, this elegantly dressed personage ceremoniously enters in silence. Thick wooden staff in hand, he stamps out a slow, deliberate rhythm. He then cues the trumpet fanfare and leads in a procession of 6 courtiers who bow before him and the audience. Bergman adopts such Baroque conventions, including the reshaped stage, not simply to assimilate an authentic 18th century setting. They help reinforce and clarify the framing effect already implied by Stravinsky's prelude and epilogue. Besides announcing the beginning of each act, Bergman's master of ceremonies also asserts a controlling presence throughout the opera. He organizes Tom's London household in the curtailed opening of Act 2. He claps his hands to dismiss the London street revelers at the beginning of Act 2 Scene 2. He again stamps everyone to attention after intermission, then passes a curtain marked night in front of Tom's bed to reveal the already estranged newlyweds. Finally, he leads the principals to center stage for the epilogue. This liminal master of ceremonies is just one of several carefully controlled elements Bergman uses to create the feeling of a puppet theater. He uses the curtain not to separate scenes and disguise set changes, but as a placard to signal important stages in the plot. The scenes are changed in open view. Members of the cast first take their places on a bare stage, and only then are the sets carried in or lowered from above. Bergman's gray settings, which suggest the engravings of Hogarth, are placed only on that central section of the stage behind the extension, leaving darkened areas outside of the set that Bergman also uses at significant moments. Lit by a special spot, Tom is the first to cross off stage for his first aria, Here I Stand. Shortly thereafter, Nick waits appropriately in the shadows before stepping on stage to explain Tom's unexpected fortune. Then he returns at the end of the scene to proclaim, "The progress of a rake begins." These precisely choreographed movements on and off the Baroque stage aren't arbitrary, but clarify the theatrical dimensions implicit in Stravinsky's score and Auden's text. Tom's opening aria concludes with the first of his 3 spoken wishes, and throughout the opera, Nick Shadow's periodic asides mediate between the story and audience. Thus, the darkened offstage is a natural space for him. Bergman's puppet theater effect is most pronounced in his handling of the chorus, whose movements are closely tied to the music. During the brothel and bedlam scenes, they are first seen at the back of the stage, completely frozen. In the words of one critic, like a carved frieze. They spring into action with the music, but relapse into stillness again when it focuses elsewhere. Bergman even dictates the rhythm of their applause. Like Balanchine's direction at the Metropolitan Opera, Bergman often stages set-piece ensembles, such as the quartet in Scene 1 and Anne and Father Truelove's duet in Bedlam, with the singers anchored in place directly facing the audience. This effect is most pronounced when Anne delivers her cabaletta upstage center, her concluding high C rounded off with a conspicuously deep bow to the audience. What makes such gestures stylized, while Balanchine's were merely static, is that Bergman's form a series of carefully composed tableaux. Another crucial difference, according to Robert Kraft, is that Bergman's singers act, move their bodies, and use their eyes, as singers are rarely trained to do. Bergman's novel combination of highly controlled movement and close attention to characterization and expression would create a deceptively profound experience for the viewer. Another critic writes, "His method with the rake has been to make the musical fable all the more real and striking through highly artificial means. Mr. Bergman wisely banishes naturalism. His characters are puppets whose personalities acquire life and depth through the music. But because they are presented with the breath-catching simplicity of a conjurer and the eyes of a seer, they seem twice as real and twice as human." Critics often label such overt stylization, be it Bergman's staging or Stravinsky's music, as Brechtian, because it functions to distance the spectator. But in fact, such effects have been common to the theater at least since the Renaissance. Bergman's imposition of 18th century theatrical conventions, the deep, narrow stage, and the master of ceremonies, both charmingly capture the period setting and impose the emotional distance he sought. All this, the director explained to one interviewer, is Bergman's way of breaking the intense realism he often develops in portraying the rake's downward path to death in an insane asylum. When the audience is especially moved, the mood must be broken, because Stravinsky wants to tell you something, and that something is the moral of this morality play. The devil finds work for idle hands. Bergman creates this intense realism through the expressive characterizations that Kraft refers to, going so far as to invent an individual character for each member of the chorus. Here you see 3 of the dozens of individual photographic portraits he had taken. Such attention to characterization wasn't the only evidence of a filmmaker's touch. One critic summarizes the production's profound aesthetic and emotional impact. Bergman's attention to detail is astonishing. The brilliantly hued costumes, the gray settings against the pitch-black background, and a dramatic use of lights combine to achieve such rich visual effect that the music often seems to emerge from a soundtrack, and the singing seems a natural way of communicating. The key to Bergman's breakthrough production is that he understood Stravinsky's very cold, hot way of expressing himself. He created emotional distance not because the composer's opera was stiff and impersonal, but because he understood that Stravinsky's music was at heart ardent and personal.